Thank you all. Thank you for coming. Many federal programs tax the young to support the elderly. You have only to think of the Social Security program, the Medicare program, parts of the Affordable Care Act, and they're not the only ones. This panel will discuss whether that is sustainable. And of course, whether it's sustainable depends on the growth rate. If the economy grows fast enough, those still younger will be able to repeat the cycle. But will the economy grow fast enough? Transfers may hurt growth, and there's the conundrum. To discuss that, we have three speakers, and we'll follow the standard practice at these meetings. There'll be presentations, there'll be an exchange among members of the panel, and then questions from the audience. I'm going to give brief introductions of the speakers in the order in which they will speak. You can find more information about them in the program. Our first speaker will be Christopher Demuth, who at the moment is a fellow of the Hudson Institute. For 22 years, he was president of the American Enterprise Institute. Before that, among his other jobs, he was the head of regulation at OMB for President Reagan, what's now the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. He also has been a managing director of Lexicon, a position we held in common, and is a member of my law school class, University of Chicago, 1973. And just in case this leaves you in any doubt, that means both Chris and I are now on the receiving end of all of these wonderful transfers. You should take interest into account in deciding what to make of what everybody on this panel says. Our second speaker will be David Weisbach. After some private practice, he became an attorney advisor and then the assistant tax legislative counsel at the Office of Tax Legislative Counsel. He's been on law faculties since 1996, at the University of Chicago since 1998. He teaches tax. He knows about tax. He actually knows about a lot more too, but he actually knows huge amounts about tax. And the third, completing the Chicago trifecta, is John McGinnis, who is now at Northwestern in Chicago. His government service was at the Office of Legal Counsel, where he was Deputy Assistant Attorney General from 1987 to 1991. He's been teaching law for a good long time now, and in his spare time, he arbitrates WTO disputes. Chris.
Thank you, Judge Easterbrook. I would tell you what we called him back in law school, but Judge Easterbrook is known to be unsparing in sanctioning the misbehavior of counsel arguing before him, so I'm going to keep it to myself. Intergenerational equity in policy and politics refers to the obligations of living generations to future generations, and among we the living, of older persons to children and youth. It is treacherous territory because of two strong characteristics of modern democratic politics that sharply conflict. The first is that our politics is aspirational, improving, progressive. It wants to make the world a better place. And by definition, that better place is in the more or less distant future. It is getting the unemployment rate down a year from now, or high-speed rail from Cedar Rapids to Chicago in 10 years, or a better climate in 100 years. On the other hand, our politics is relentlessly present-oriented because political leaders are going to face the electorate and its immediate concerns in 2, 4, at the outside 6 years, and in the meantime need to satisfy well-organized constituency groups whose interests are even more here and now. One result is that progressive leaders always say that their programs for future improvements are not going to be costly to voters today, but will actually be beneficial. That is usually false and is often unpersuasive. For example, the Keystone Pipeline pits large and palpable immediate benefits against far distant future benefits that involve a complex chain of causation and are difficult to explain. Another is that providing for the future and providing for immediate constituency groups often combines in ways where the immediate constituencies win out. Thus, the strongest example of redistribution from older people to younger people is the enormous resources that we devote to the education of the young. But it is the teachers' unions who are the primary proponents of this spending and are also its immediate recipients. These complications mean that it is risky to follow the simple tropes that we hear about intergenerational equity. For example, it is said that the greedy geezers like Judge Easterbrook and myself and our AARP lobbyists are fleecing the young to maintain subsidized retirement income and medical care. But the fleecees often include all of the older people in this room, and emphatically those in the oldest category of the judge and myself. That is because Social Security is a pay-as-you-go income transfer system from workers to retirees, but it began paying full benefits in the 1940s, and for the earliest generations of the earliest cohorts, they were receiving full benefits while they had not paid in nearly as much as people that came later, so that the effective rate of return on one's payroll taxes has been going progressively downward. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, Congress compensated by increasing Social Security benefits 10% and more every year. Those benefits paid to the retirees of the late 1960s and 1970s were financed by taxes that came in from that cohort of taxpayers, whose own benefits were then tapered quite dramatically for themselves into the future from the 1982 Social Security reforms. Similarly, the recently approved Detroit bankruptcy plan cuts the benefits of current elderly pensioners. They're still pretty generous pensions, I'd say, but they certainly are a reduction from what these individuals had been promised and in fact guaranteed by state law and had relied upon. The millennials referred to in this morning's program are said to be low information voters who are gaga over President Obama and don't realize that they are the paymasters of the president's health care program. But in fact, the redistributions in Obamacare are largely from healthier individuals to less healthy, and the young are simply incidental to that, and many of them seem to be resisting the government advertising seeking to get them to enroll in large numbers, and they're getting a lot out of the current system too. They get highly concessionary loans to go to college. While they are there, they get free birth control while they are building their human capital. And afterwards, if the loans turn out not to have been that productive and they can't find work, there is the prospect that the loans will be retrospectively converted into grants and forgiven. In my view, the deepest understanding of the intergenerational equity implications of Social Security, health care, and pensions comes not from trying to look at the statutory benefits and costs that fall upon different particular cohorts, but rather at looking at the intertemporal and other characteristics of our government finances as a whole, which are largely a function of those programs. I want to mention three characteristics. One is that our public debt today is vastly higher than anything in our national experience. The recorded formal national debt is $18 trillion, a little bit over 100% of annual gross domestic product. In the years since the financial collapse of 2008, on average, our debt has been about what it was on average during the years of World War II, the previous high. That was years of desperate national mobilization, in the face of the greatest conflagration in human history. It came hard on the heels of the Great Depression that had already raised our national debt to 40% of GDP, far higher than any previous time as a percentage of GDP, including Civil War, World War I, and so forth. But in fact, the current debt is much smaller than it was during World War II because of three important post-war developments. The first is public sector unionization, which has led to what is best estimated at $3 to $4 trillion of unfunded pension liabilities of state and municipal governments. That's another 20 to 24% of gross domestic product right there. The second is the post-war innovation of promoting private borrowing, especially for housing and college education. These matters are off budget. In fact, the Obama administration counts Fannie and Freddie, now government wards, as profit centers. And they are highly profitable for the time being. And a $900 billion of government student loans are counted as an assets on the federal books. But Fannie and Freddie turned in a surprise bill of $190 billion in 2008. Its portfolio and the student loan portfolio is filled with risk. The total portfolio is about $5 trillion right now, and it's pretty clear that the risk attributes imply several $100 billion that are not counted as part of the debt. Third and most importantly, Social Security increases that I mentioned and the establishment of the Medicare and Medicaid programs are post-war phenomena. If you take the projected future statutory benefits and statutory tax revenues of these two programs and reduce them to a present value, you get somewhere between 50 trillion and 200 trillion in implicit national debt. That's a huge variation. It depends on the number of years you look into the future, whether you assume Congress will continue to fix doctors, increase doctors' salaries from year to year, differences in views of future economic growth. But these are enormous numbers. They are a result not just of the statutory changes, but the concurrent demographic transition of the baby boom, followed by much lower birth rates and much increased longevity that are unraveling the pay-as-you-go structure of those systems. The size is unimportant. All you have to know is that nobody has any idea of how we could possibly get hold of the resources to maintain these programs into the future. If we turned it into tax rates, it would be increasing the tax rates for future generations by at least 50%, which would certainly be self-defeating. The second aspect of our current finances is that this enormous debt is substantially the result of the emergence of routine, regular, annual, very large deficits at the federal level since 1970. Previously, deficits were incurred for wars or other emergencies, natural disasters, economic disasters, and were repaid, understood that they would be repaid when the good times, or at least normalcy, returned. Keynes was himself a budget balancer over the business cycle. But in the 44 years since 1980, we have had a deficit in 40 of those years, in good times and bad, during emergencies and during good times. In the 1970s, it averaged 10% of federal spending. It grew to 18% of federal spending in the 80s, fell back to 10% in the 90s, 11% in the 2000s, 36% since 2008, now down to about 16%, about 20% of federal spending. Everybody thinks it'll be about 16% of spending over the next decade. The Obama administration seems to be copacetic With that, the Republicans say that that's unacceptable, but they're simply being rhetorical about the matter. If you take all of Paul Ryan's proposals, if you take every budget-cutting proposal to come out of every Republican committee in the House over the past 2 years and add them up, we're still going to have huge annual deficits over the next decade. The third, and by far the most important, is the profound change in the nature of government spending that is perfectly coincident with these years of routinized annual debt. And that is a change from spending on public goods to spending on transfer payments, which are, for all practical purposes, spending on current consumption. Traditionally, we financed by debt public goods with long lifespans, canals, highways, airports, national expansion. The Louisiana Purchase was largely debt financed. Disasters and recovery from disasters, economic problems, and from wars. Investments didn't always work out. Wars are lost at least half the time, but at least these were intended to expand and improve the future, and it was intergenerationally equitable to spread the burdens across the generations that would benefit. That is not the case today. I have categorized federal expenditures as public goods, which is defense, international operations, highways, courts, law enforcement, Congress, regulation, and payments to individuals, cash such as Social Security and unemployment, in kind such as Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps, housing. In 1970, when the debt was 36% of GDP, 64% of federal spending was on public goods, 36% on transfers. Today, only 25% of federal spending is on public goods. 75% of it is on transfers to individuals. We have built a consumption state, which is just fine. We are an affluent, consuming society. The worrisome thing is that we have built a debt-financed consumption state. Our de facto bipartisan policy is continuous borrowing for private consumption. It is not going to last. There are three scenarios. We could have far-sighted reforms to Social Security, Medicare. I've got to the tax system that David attends to. I've got all my favorites, but they've been worked out by academics and think tankers over many years, and our political leaders seem to have not much particular interest in them, and the demographic transition means we've only got about 10 years before we could introduce such reforms and taper them in so as not to defeat expectations. The second is the slow motion budget default of inflation, and the third is to wait until a crisis appears that would defeat people's expectations, impose windfall losses on many people of modest means, and worst case scenario, impose widespread misery, loss of social morale as in Greece, or Kirchner-style Argentine confiscations. One way or the other, we are going to move from a debt-financed to a currently financed welfare state in some considerable degree. Whether the burden of that transition falls on baby boomers or millennials today or the yet unborn is impossible to predict. All we can say with reasonable certainty is that the practice of billing current consumption by today's electorate to non-voting future electorates or some subset of them is a bad habit that is not going to persist. I would call it a transition problem of adapting to a world of mass affluence. Thank you.
Thanks. Well, Chris just gave us a whole litany of bad numbers. I'll start with a few more terrifying numbers, and then maybe turn to defending Social Security, which I think is not that hard to do. Okay, so the numbers are pretty terrifying. What we know is because of an aging population and rapid growth in healthcare spending, that debt will grow relative to GDP. Right now, our debt is about 100% of GDP, but it's predicted to go to several 100% over the next 20, 30, or 40 years. Entitlements are projected to make up essentially all of the federal budget. So right now, Social Security and Medicare, Medicare and Medicaid make up 41% of federal expenditures. Revenues are around 18% or 18.5% of GDP right now. Just healthcare and interest expenditures are supposed to be 18% of GDP by 2026. So just healthcare spending would eat up all of the federal budget in the next 12 years. The trust funds, so Medicare Trust Fund, the HI Trust Fund is projected to run out by 2030. So in the immediate future, that's Medicare Part A, that's the inpatient part of Medicare. The SMI Trust Fund is not projected to run out because that's financed in a different way, but the spending on Parts B and D of Medicare are expected to double over the next 75 years. And both of those estimates, the elimination or the bankruptcy of the HI Trust Fund and the doubling of the B and D payments include savings from the Affordable Care Act. Right? If you don't think those savings are actually going to occur, then the numbers are worse than that. Social Security, the trust fund is expected to be depleted by 2033. That's for the old age trust fund. The DI trust fund runs out in 2016, so almost next year. When the old age trust fund runs out of money, we can only pay 75% of the promised benefits. As Herbert Stein said, when something can't go on forever, it won't, or it will stop. And so there'll be some combination of entitlement reforms or tax changes. Right? When you see these projections of impossible spending, well, they are impossible. There'll be some combination, and they're going to come in the future. They will dominate the political discussion over the next 20 or 30 years. Okay, what about intergenerational transfers? We don't know exactly how that's going to occur. If you look at something called generational accounting, it tries to estimate what each generation will pay or receive in net transfers or net payments. The numbers don't look so good. The current old are very, very large recipients of payments, and the current young are kind of net recipients. The millennials are still net recipients. It's the unborn generations that are likely to bear the burden of any kind of reform, but as Chris emphasized, it's hard to know because you don't know what the combination of tax cuts and entitlement reforms will be, so any sort of projection like that is very speculative. The third point, again agreeing with Chris, is the political process is not well structured to deal with this problem. Right? It's very, very easy to make promises now and have the payments be made in the future, and I think one of the most important problems to think about, especially for lawyers, is how to structure the budget process and the political process to take those things into account in a better way. All right, so that's the terrifying predictions. Let me focus on Social Security and talk about why I think it's actually a good program. And I'll say that Social Security is easier to think about than healthcare because it's a pure transfer program. Right? Healthcare has other things going on, particularly it's a spending program, if you will. You're spending on either insurance or directly on healthcare itself. And that's more complicated because you have to understand how that spending works. You have to understand the details of the healthcare system. And also because providing people healthcare provides them actual benefits, longevity, for example. And so that makes it more complicated to think about as well. Social Security, though, is just transfers of cash, relatively easy to think about. Okay, so let me imagine a simplified world where we have a very, very simple Social Security system and talk about how that works, and then talk about then how it would relate to the actual Social Security system. So imagine that there's generations, and each generation lives for two periods, the working period and a retirement period. And first generation then lives for period 1 and 2, second generation for 2 and 3, third generation 3 and 4, and so forth out to perpetuity. So that each generation is retired when the next generation is working, and so forth. And let's suppose, hypothetically, it's not true, hypothetically, that savings for the future is literally impossible. Okay, there are no savings vehicles at all. What are the retirees of, say, generation 1 going to live on? They can't. They have nothing to live on at all. The only thing they can do is ask current workers to support them. Now, they ask current workers, generation 2, to support them. What will generation 2 do? Well, they say, well, why should I do that? I love you a little bit, but not so much. They may agree to give less than is really needed. Now, suppose we agree to the following contract. During the period of work for each generation, they agree to make a payment to the prior generation based on their wages. And now what will generation 2 do? Generation 2 would agree to that contract because they know they'll get payments from Generation 3. And Generation 3 would agree to that contract because they know they'll get payments from Generation 4. Right? It's a pay-as-you-go retirement system. Each generation is paying for the retirement of the prior one, and it's totally unfunded. It's a pure transfer program. Okay. Now, what can we say about that program? First of all, it's completely sustainable. Right? There is no long-term budgetary problem with that program. Right? Each generation gets paid by the next generation, and it goes on and on. Now, if there's a last generation, they lose, but they've got other things to worry about, I guess, if they're the last generation. But leaving aside that very, very last generation problem, which hopefully is in the distant future, the program is completely sustainable. Okay. Second thing is you can have real benefit growth in this program. Right? Why? Suppose that wages grow with each generation. So we have wage growth, we have increased productivity in the economy, and each generation pays a percentage of their wages to the prior generation. Right? Then, as wages grow, the benefits grow. So you can not only have a stable program that's completely unfunded, you can have a program with growing benefits over the indefinite future that's completely unfunded and that works completely fine. Not only that, if the population grows, then benefits can grow with both wages and population, and it's completely unfunded and it works perfectly well. Okay. This program resembles what we have now, Social Security program, and Social Security is by a very large margin the most important anti-poverty program we have in the United States. And if you look at the bottom quartile of people over 65 and older, 84% of their income comes from Social Security. Right? It is by a very, very large margin the single most important program we have for poverty reduction. Okay, now you may say this is unrealistic. Of course people can save. So let's think about what happens if people can save. How might that change the dynamics of the program? Well, people may save, and many people may save for the future, but there are reasons to think you would still need a program. Some people are myopic and won't save fully. But in addition, if you don't have a program like this, there's a real moral hazard problem. You have an incentive to undersave so that you can say, I need help now when I'm old. Right? So in order to prevent the moral hazard problem of undersaving, you might want to have a mandatory savings program in place like this, in order to reduce the inefficiencies. In addition, people that are old and are retired face a real risk, if they save, of their assets being depleted for something like the financial crisis. So the program acts as a risk, or as an insurance system. It prevents the moral hazard of undersaving, and it helps people that are myopic, right? It might be plain old paternalistic. So when we add savings, the need for the program goes away a little bit, but not entirely. Right? And indeed, every Western state, every developed state has thought that the need for such a program is true. How many time? 5 minutes, perfect. Okay, so why is the current program then in such trouble if it's so straightforward and simple to think about? Well, the current program's in trouble because of some of the design elements. And in particular, there's a lack of match between the payments we promise people and the benefits we promise people and the payments into the system. The benefits we promise people are statutory. They're based on someone's prior earnings in the past, their aim, their average income, average monthly earnings over the 35 years that they worked. The payments into the program are based on current wages. Right? And those two things are not designed to line up. My hypothetical system that was fully sustainable, yet unfunded, matched the benefits people receive to the payments people are making into the system. The actual system doesn't do that. In addition, the actual system doesn't take into account changes in demographics. Right? So not only are the payments people receive not tied to the wages or the taxes people are paying now, they're not tied to the number of people that are paying into the system now. Right? And that mismatch between the benefits promised and the payments being made into the system is what causes a long-term problem. Right? In a simpler system, or maybe a better designed system, those two things would be tied together. Right? So there's a risk built into the system, and we're facing that risk now because of the large bulge in retirees due to Frank and Chris's generation. Right? So people like me are paying. Right, I'm actually born in '63, and people often put me in the baby boom generation. I object entirely to that characterization. Okay, so how do we fix this? What about the dire circumstances, all those horrible numbers that Chris talked about and I talked about in the beginning of my talk here? How do we fix Social Security? Well, it's not easy politically, but I'm a tenured academic, so it's easy for me to say it's simple to fix. And it is in the abstract sense, right? There are many, many ways to fix it. The long-term deficit in Social Security is not that dire. And if you change any number of the little dials in the system, you can change 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 of them, you can easily make the payments going in match the payments going out. Right, so for example, you can slowly increase the retirement age on the theory that people are retired longer now than they used to. You can increase the maximum, right now you pay Social Security on about $110,000 of wage income. You can increase that maximum up more so that the percentage of wages in the system matches what it used to be. Now, because of increasing inequality, fewer total wages are in the system than were, say, 30 or 40 years ago. So you can increase the maximum, the cap on wages. You can change how you measure inflation. So Obama proposed changing how we measure inflation in the system. You can change or get rid of wage indexing and go to price indexing on the system. Any combination of these things, or little bits and pieces of those things, would balance out the Social Security problem, right? It's not that hard from an abstract perspective. What's hard is politically, right? So what you saw with W. Bush was he proposed changes to the system. He had a commission, a bipartisan commission that thought about how to change it, and the Democrats drew and quartered him over this, right? Just like the Republicans drew and quartered Obama over health care, right? So the politics of both Social Security and Medicare are really toxic, but at least for Social Security, this sort of, the economics of it are not all that hard for it to be sustainable. And it's important for it to be sustainable, again, because it is, I think, the single most important anti-poverty program we have. So I'll stop there.
Well, I'm going to talk a bit about intergenerational equity and begin with a description in the panel. Description in the panel entertains a common claim, I think, about old age entitlements, that they transfer resources from a poorer generation to a richer one because young people today are likely to be less well off than their elders. I think that claim is almost surely wrong. Nevertheless, in the absence of substantial reform, old age entitlements do raise a substantial risk for everyone in the nation, young and old, and also add to some of the risks that were discussed by the previous speakers. But first of all, I want to suggest that the happy story, that the young are likely to be much better off. The history of economic growth in the United States suggests that as they age, they're going to be better off than the old are today. Since 1950, less than a lifetime, real GDP per capita in the U.S. has almost tripled, and economic growth continues, even if the statistics suggest it's slowing down somewhat. And I think the slowdown is in some sense an illusion, at least in the sense of capturing well-being, because it fails to fully account for the two greatest ongoing revolutions in our time, the improvements in healthcare and the exponential increases in machine intelligence. First, take improvements in healthcare and longevity. They don't even really show up in GDP, and yet they are massive. It is not at all clear that I would choose to have the healthcare of 1950 and the income of today rather than the income of 1950 and the healthcare of today. That's how different it is. Life expectancy continues to increase by almost 2.5 years with every passing decade, and genomics and personalized medicine promise more improvement, perhaps even at a faster rate. If the young live longer and healthier lives than their parents, they are by that consideration alone likely to be better off, because longer life and health trumps income for most of us. Second, the growth of machine intelligence is the most important phenomenon of our time, and its exponential rate of change will likely increase the wealth of the younger generation more than any other in history. Moore's Law, which I'm sure most of you have heard of, captures a central regularity of our age. Computer power doubles every 18 months or 2 years. The computational capacity in a cell phone today is 1,000 times greater and 1,000,000 times cheaper than all the computer power at MIT in 1965. And if you continue to project that further, in 30 years from now, a computer could exceed today's computer by 1,000,000 times. Of course, Moore's law will run out when the size of transistors cannot shrink further, something that's predicted to happen sometime in the late 2020s. But Moore's law is actually part of a much more general law of improvement in computation that's been going on for 100 years, from electromechanical computation to vacuum tubes, now to integrated circuits. Other methods under research today, from optical computing to quantum computing, are likely to come online and continue that very steady exponential growth. The dramatic increase in hardware capability is only part of the change in computational capacity. Software improvements, while less steady, provide another force multiplier for computational power. Computers now also interconnect among themselves and with human intelligence, sharing data more seamlessly than ever before. So what has been happening here, I think, is very well demonstrated by the recent triumph of the computer Watson, the IBM machine. It beat the best Jeopardy champions by exploiting advances in all three areas. The computer disentangled humor, recognized puns, and resolved ambiguity. Unlike its big predecessor, Big Blue, which defeated the world chess champion 14 years ago, Watson succeeded at much less precisely defined problems, one that looks a bit more like the chaotic world we inhabit. This kind of fluidity and connectivity enables computing applications in an increasing number of areas. Watson is going into medical diagnostics, interacting with the falling cost of genomics, which is itself a computerized enterprise. Everyone here, I'm sure, has heard of Google self-driving cars, but traditional car companies believe this is happening. Volvo is putting self-driving cars in one city in Sweden by 2017. Drones will be regularly delivering packages in the next decade. And let me be clear here, the story of machine intelligence and the way it is broadening its scope in changing all sorts of spheres of human life is always really the same. Once it gains a foothold, it improves until it radically dominates and transforms the world. I realized that personally. I could beat the best chess computer when I was at high school. Now I'm regularly humiliated by my smartphone. Incidentally, if lawyers think they'll be immune to this computational revolution, they are very mistaken. For instance, when I was an associate, I spent much of my first year sitting in a room rifling through documents. That work is now going to machines. Computers can sort much better than people because of fatigue, boredom, and distraction, and yes, I experienced all of those in that room. Reduced human accuracy, happily machines can work nonstop without sleep or even caffeine. And Moneyball is also coming to law, using data to better predict what case outcomes are likely to be. These are going to be transformative aspects of our own world. The result may not be good in the short run for people whose jobs can be automated, but it'll be great for productivity, delivering services to consumers at lower prices and providing services and products undreamed of 10 years ago. GDP statistics, and this goes back to, I think, the illusion of slowing down economic growth, often have problems capturing such dramatic changes in goods and services. Briefly, inflation calculations require that we compare baskets of goods from one year to the next, but the faster technology changes, the harder the comparison. What does one compare the internet to years ago? This effect tends to overstate inflation and understate economic growth. In short, everything we know about the exponential power of information technology suggests that not only will millennials lead longer, healthier lives, but they will live in a much wealthier nation. To be young is still very heaven, and to be unborn may be best of all. These projections squarely raise the question of intergenerational equity, but I think they raise it in the other direction. If the younger generation is likely to be better off, why shouldn't we transfer the old? be sanguine about old age entitlements, and not worry about fundamental reforms, or at least too much. I think there are three reasons, in addition to the some that have been discussed, not to be sanguine. First, because of human nature, each generation wants the next generation to be better off. It is odd to redistribute against the preferences of the beneficiaries. Most people have children, and others have nieces and nephews. They are committed to their future welfare, even at the expense of their own. This is clear not only from polling, but from human action. People of any means almost invariably try to leave their children an inheritance rather than partying down into old age. One might ask why, nevertheless, old people often vote to keep their entitlements intact. First, most people are rationally ignorant of politics. Polls regularly show that people don't recognize the amount of money that goes to intergenerational transfers, thinking instead that foreign aid is the leading cost to the budget. Second, Social Security and Medicare are cleverly denominated trust funds, so that many, if not most, think we're only getting back what we paid in. And finally, the old have no confidence, and this lack of confidence is probably justified, given the weak restraints on government spending, that the money saved on entitlements won't be squandered elsewhere. At least if they live off Social Security, that may allow them to pass on more of their own savings to their descendants. The older generation may also worry about risks that could make it harder for the next generation to produce yet another generation. That may well be a biological impulse. And that brings me to the second reason why we should really worry about old age entitlements. Large transfer programs put the government on autopilot with a larger and larger amount of money already allocated. There's something called, a very useful thing, called the Stuhl-Roper Index of Fiscal Democracy. And what that does is it measures the percentages of revenues remaining to the federal government after accounting for revenues already allocated to entitlements or interest on the debt, which we've already heard are really going up. And that percentage, the percentage of unallocated funds, has been steadily declining, and on current projection is projected to disappear in the next decade. And if this were a panel about constitutional law, we'd be talking about the dead hand. But the entitlements are a real dead hand. They are the dead hand of the past, constraining the fiscal choices of future generations. And that kind of spending handcuffs society's ability to deal with new collective risks. It's hard for democracy to ramp up new spending to address a risk when a large amount is already handed out in transfers. For instance, the higher rate of taxation necessary to pay for entitlements, the harder it's going to be, the harder that is, the harder it's going to be to raise taxes to address some new risk. And the very technological acceleration that I have described is going to lead to more risks as well as more wealth. Abroad, the risks are obvious. New kinds of weapons of mass destruction can come from nano and biotechnology, and those kinds of weapons will be very well designed, perhaps, for terrorist groups to deliver them. And there'll need to be new kinds of defense in that respect. And there are also risks at home. 3 million people drive for a living. Self-driving cars will be a great boon. They'll reduce accidents, make our lives much easier, but they'll be a tremendous threat to jobs. More generally, machine intelligence will rapidly encroach on a variety of middle-class white-collar jobs as software like Watson's does routine work. Now, I'm not a Luddite. I don't think there's a lump sum of jobs in the world, but it does mean that this displacement may well require innovative government programs to education and training to help people transition to new work. And these are just a few of the new possible risks of technological acceleration. Others might focus on matters as varied as climate change and machine intelligence takeover. These are known unknowns, but with technological acceleration, we also face unknown unknowns as well. My third concern about entitlements is the political climate they create. Addressing these new risks as well as old risks requires social cohesion. Entitlements that are provided without any means testing do pit one class of people against another, creating a political culture that then becomes more amenable for further such conflicts. Preventing such conflicts based on largely arbitrary fault lines is a great challenge for modern American democracy, which has few formal restraints on wealth transfers. A culture in which resources can be redistributed from one group to another creates a kind of Hobbesian war, all against all in our fiscal relations. The rhetoric of this war, and we hear it all the time, war on the old, the war on the young, the war on women. Put in your favorite group of choice. The war on someone, I think, obscures the need for the government to protect us against our common risks, the fundamental issues that Krista Muth talked that public goods can protect against invasion and catastrophe, and establish rules that facilitate invention and exchange. We, I think, have in Europe a warning of the consequences of an entitlement society where all sorts of groups have claim rights on one another. That society really can't defend itself without the help of the United States. So in conclusion, I think it's important to recognize that Edmund Burke was right when he understood that society is indeed an intergenerational compact, but that doesn't mean we should think about creating a society in which each generation has an equal share of wealth over their lifetimes. It's in the nature of things that the old will want the young to do better than themselves. Today, an unreformed entitlement state is a risk to the young and to the rest of us because it disables government from addressing serious new challenges. By reforming entitlements, we can empower government to address the risks that are coming. We can also create a better political culture, one that doesn't encourage jockeying for a bigger transfer of resources from the government, but focusing on the common good that transcends generations.
John McGinnis mentioned Edmund Burke. He also used the word reform. I do want to remind you that one of Burke's favorite phrases was, "Don't talk to me about reform. Things are bad enough as they are." But here we are. Reform is the subject of this panel, and as John McGinnis pointed out, one of the things that's going on is that average life expectation rises between 2 and 3 months every year. People are living longer and are therefore, Krista Muth and I will spend more years in the category of recipients of these transfers than people expected. So what dials does one twiddle? David Weisbach suggested twiddling the dial for the tax rate or the tax ceiling or the rate at which benefits change. One could also, given the increase in life expectation, make changes, probably quite dramatic changes, in the expected age of retirement. But there are other possibilities. You could, for example, try to arrest the increase in average total life expectation. The government could undertake to provide free cigarettes for everyone. So there are many dials one could turn. I would like to give each member of the panel a couple minutes to address points made by the other, and then we will open the floor to questions. So, Chris?
Thank you, Judge Easterbrook. I'd like to make one or two comments elaborating, not arguing with, but elaborating on the excellent comments of talks by David and John. Social Security certainly has been a hugely successful anti-poverty program, but because of the very complexities of the benefit and payment formulas, it is still highly imperfect. Whether one has worked for long periods of time, short periods of time, if one is separated, has impacts on what a low-wage earner can expect that very few people understand, and there are huge gaps. The dials that I would turn, I would certainly increase the age of retirement and make some of those changes. I would have a single program that is David's pay-as-you-go program that is somewhat smaller than the current one, but is explicitly redistributive and is intended to help to provide a safety net in old age. And I would combine that with a great improvement in our savings, tax-favored savings programs, make them mandatory, streamline them, make it a part of everybody's financial planning from early on in life, or even move to a well-constructed consumption tax system. Let me say a word about the family, which came up once or twice. The family is actually the most important social institution of intergenerational equity. It is the engine that creates the next generation and that provides for the next generation as best it can. And it operates right next to these social retirement and medical programs. So, for example, when we talk about the burdens on the young supporting the old, the average Social Security benefit is now between $15,000 and $16,000 a year. The highest Social Security tax, the maximum, is now $14,700, and the tax exclusion is now $14,000, I believe, per year per individual, so that the average household, one individual can completely eliminate the tax burden on one child. And for many people who don't rely completely on Social Security, they could do it for more and wipe out that tax burden in a tax-free way. So there's a lot of recycling that's going on that we have to think about. On the other hand, the Social Security programs, the big ones in the United States and the OECD, are there's strong evidence that they are retarding family formation and retarding in-family fertility because of the tax burdens that they put on young people that are starting out their lives, and because they partially sever the link between the number of children you have and retirement. So these two interact in complicated ways. A few quick points about John's excellent points. Precisely because the future has always looked bright, and he gives us several examples why the apparent slowdown in growth may exaggerate some of the great improvements we're seeing right now. It's actually part of the problem. Since Keynes, in thinking about government budgets, we're not just balancing current resources against current expenses, demands. We're actually looking at future resources and current problems. But the present time is always filled with problems and difficulties and more demands than we can fulfill. And in the American mind, the future is bright and clear. First of all, we're imagining it, but it is a source of resources. And this has actually had, I think, an insidious effect. Currently, I do not think, if you look at the estimates of future growth, I don't think that there's anything in plausible future growth that can eliminate this huge amount this business of borrowing huge amounts for current consumption. I don't think we can defeat that logic. Maybe we can. Maybe there'll be an anti-gravity machine. Maybe I can transport myself to Singapore by just pressing a button on this. And there would be fantastic new developments that would give borrowing for current consumption a new lease on life. That's possible, but I put John's concluding point a little bit different. Those things would be wonderful, but government is supposed to be ready for bad unexpected surprises. Hope for good ones, but be ready for bad ones. The reason we want low public debt is not because of accounting concerns. It's to be ready to react to emergencies that individuals cannot respond to in their private lives. And even if we do everything right in getting ourselves out of this fix, the next couple of decades are going to be high-risk periods. Throughout this period are 2 centuries of wonderful growth and prosperity, financial crises, epidemics, natural disasters, wars, needs for defense buildups have been routine, and we've faced many, many of them just in the past couple of decades. If a few big ones came in the near term, we would be in pretty severe difficulty, and the very fragility of our circumstances, I think, may be inviting emergencies of the man-made kind.
Okay, Ms. Hun? Thanks. Let me just respond a little bit to that. So Chris said one of the problems with Social Security are the complexities of the system make it imperfect, and I didn't talk about those, and I should have. So Social Security is deliberately sold as a savings program, and the progressivity of the system is not transparent or even hidden in a way. And I think those are possibly two problems with the system, although I should say I'm a tenured academic. FDR was one of our greatest politicians. He probably knows better than I do, but it's possible, if you can imagine, a system where we understood that these were transfers, where each generation understood that part of their obligation was, through a system like this, to help the prior generation. And you can imagine a social compact that looked like that rather than one that looks like the existing Social Security system where people think, although it's not true, that the money they put away in Social Security is being saved for them, right? So if you made it more transparent, you can still imagine an effective social compact. Same with the progressivity in the system. People understand the tax system is progressive, and the nation has supported that for 100 years, and you can imagine the same thing with Social Security, where they understand that it's progressive and yet support the system. As for dials, Chris only did Social Security dials, so I'll punt to that as well, because Medicare is just simply too hard for me to think about. So retirement age, I think, and the ceiling on earnings are two obvious ones to adjust in a way to both to sort of go back to where we were in terms of number of years that people are getting Social Security in retirement, or what our expectations are for work in terms of their longevity. And increasing the ceiling on taxable earnings goes back to where we were in terms of the percentage of taxable earnings in the system that are taxed. You might also think about inflation adjustments too, which is what Obama proposed. And some combination of those things pretty easily balances out the system. Let me just ask one question for John about growth, which is I understand GDP and estimates don't reflect healthcare improvements. But the computational improvements you point to, those are baked in to the estimates that are terrifying that Chris started with. And so I guess I hear you that those are important, but those are in the estimates that show that the system's unsustainable. And so I guess I didn't quite understand why or how that reflect, or how the computational changes reflect anything going on here.
Okay, so let me just make three quick points, and with the response to that question. The first is, I think Chris DeMuth and I are saying really very similar things. I'm suggesting that we likely, and of course in discussing intergenerational equity, we have to in some sense project what we think is going to happen in the future. I'm giving my best estimate and the reasons for it, but I think even with that rather optimistic scenario about how things are going to improve, I think these intergenerational transfers do create risks. And they create risks because the very aspects of accelerating technology that lead to these happy prospects, machine intelligence and things changing very quickly, I think lead also to a lot of social risk. To put it in the most abstract way, humans in some sense aren't even very well designed for very fast growth. I mean, we most of the era in our evolutionary history, we really lived in a world which didn't change much from one generation to another. It's going to be very disruptive to have the kinds of changes that I think are best projected by the growth in machine intelligence. They're going to create all sorts of risks coming from abroad, as traditional societies are even more dislocated with terrorism and then these possibility of weapons of mass destruction. And so that precisely makes me entirely agree with Chris DeMuth that we need to focus the government on what it traditionally does, deal with public goods that raise these kinds of collective risks to society. And so even despite the fact that I'm somewhat maybe more optimistic than he is about the prospects of economic growth, I think for the reason that we're going to may have transfer payments that will encroach on how much we can spend for public goods, I think that is a serious risk. So I just want to underscore that. To Professor Weisbeck, I think my worry about these various fixes that are offered for Social Security is they have to go through politics. And my fear is that actually the entitlement culture has created a worse politics for the reasons I suggest, and that we would be much better off, even if this is a pretty good poverty reducing program, we'd be much better off with some structure in which we required people to save for themselves rather than give money to the government to transfer around, because I think that has an effect on transfers, even non-old age transfers. It weakens the government fiscally. I don't think it's an accident in some sense that the beginning of the progressive era begins with essentially a bribe to the elderly through Social Security. You might think that is an attack against the kind of wisdom of the generation. So let me just say one final word about I understand that growth statistics try to capture what's happening with technology. I think for various technical reasons, which we can go into, it's very difficult for them to capture wholly new kinds of structures, because that requires you to compare one basket of goods to another basket of goods, and the basket of goods are very fast changing. That comparison is extremely difficult to make.
Thank you. We are now open for questions from the floor. There are 2 microphones. If you would line up, I would appreciate it. There are some rules, however, that go with question time at the Federalist Society. I would like you to begin by identifying yourself. And second, I would like you to ask a question. This differs from a speech. And I would like the question to be reasonably short to allow more people to participate. So we'll start at the front. I apologize in advance if I can't identify you, because there's a big light shining right in my face. So all I can see is outlines of the microphone, but there is an outline of a person at each microphone. So we'll start at the front.
Robert Miller, University of Iowa College of Law and the Classical Liberal Institute at NYU Law School. So given the pusillanimous nature of politicians and the short election cycle, it's always seemed to me more likely that rather than serious entitlement reform or tax increases, they'll deal with this problem by pressuring the Federal Reserve to monetize the debt. For example, this basically happened in the United Kingdom after World War II. The Bank of England helped inflate away the British war debt. So the question for the panel is, do you think this is a very likely outcome? And if so, how do you see the deleterious effects of this working out for different constituency groups? Thank you.
Well, you can't inflate away Social Security debt, right? Because, or if it's not really debt, but call it debt, because it's indexed to the CPI, right? So inflation is not going to reduce those obligations.
But inflation would still be a larger strategy of simply reducing the effective total debt. It would have, it wouldn't be one for one, because there'd be this compensating effect on some expenditure obligations. It has the advantage in that a very large amount of our debt is owed to foreigners, so that inflation imposes some debt, some losses abroad. On the other hand, it has creates a lot of losers outside of the Treasury Department within the United States. I think that it's certainly one plausible scenario, but it's not simple. It's not without cost.
Let's go to the back microphone, please.
Hi, Harry Lewis from New York City. We've just confronted an Ebola threat that, had it spiraled in the wrong direction, it seems to be moving in a positive direction now, but had it spiraled in the wrong direction, could well have created a public health crisis, which in turn would have put tremendous stress on our government and on our entitlement systems. And I'm hearing as well that the Obama administration is considering importing Ebola cases possibly for treatment, and also that we're about to hear an announcement from the White House about some sort of executive clemency in an immigration context, which sounds to me like we may be planning to import poverty, if you like, import a lot of poor people with a lot of special health care needs or special economic needs. And it occurs to me that that sort of policy coming, in this case, from the executive branch, could be extremely destabilizing to our entitlement system.
And your question is?
And the question to the panel is, should that not be a major concern here, that policies themselves, as opposed to unexpected contingencies, could destabilize the entitlement system and create and cause it to come crashing down eventually?
Well, there are possibilities, but I think that that's pretty much intra-temporal politics. And for example, the business of whether immigrants are going to be beneficiaries, or the Silicon Valley immigrants adding to welfare and adding to the young people, adding to the base of the retirement systems. You hear a lot of that in politics, and I've got my views as to what the right answers should be, but I don't think it's a systematic problem in democracy. And the administration's response to the Ebola threats has been, front page controversy. So I don't see it as a sort of a pathology in our politics, the way the borrowing for current spending is.
Indeed, I think there is some indication from other nations that many nations who are in worse shape with respect to their old age entitlements, they really need immigrants to finance their pay-as-you-go system. So you actually might think at some point there'll even be pressure for immigration in that respect.
Front microphone, please.
Kai Alberg, Port Angeles, Washington. I'd like to ask the panel on your views on what perhaps might be more of a game changer than fiddling with the dials, and that would be, as some countries have done, privatizing Social Security and also perhaps Medicare on a voluntary basis for people initially up to a certain age. I think there's no reason why even an individual retiree would not be able to apportion how much money he wants to put into Social Security versus a private retirement account. With the low rates of return in the past of Social Security compared to the markets, one would suspect that over time more and more people would migrate to the system they see as being more profitable for themselves. What would be your views of what that would do to the problem of having to fiddle with the dials to make the system balance out?
Well, I'll say a word. My personal views are substantially in that direction. The idea of having a mandatory savings program, tax favored in some respect, to substitute for part of Social Security, and then have a sharply progressive redistributive government finance program that is a safety net for old age. I mean, that's my essential proposal. And for Medicare, my solution, which I actually think we will get to, would be to voucherize it. So that people have, essentially, everybody is guaranteed a certain amount to purchase a privately supplied insurance program of one kind or another. So those are my, those are my views. The idea that privatization will solve the financial difficulties of the system as it exists is not quite right. And people sometimes exaggerate the extent that private savings would actually exceed what you'd get from a pay-as-you-go system. So they're complicated, but largely for political reasons, I would be in favor of big elements of what you described.
Let me just say a word about privatization of Social Security, which is one of the basic claims that's made in favor of it, is that the rate of return would be higher. Because right now the rate of return on Social Security is roughly wage increases plus population changes, or maybe just wage increases. So 1 or 2% a year. If you invest your own money, you can get much higher rates of return. But the key thing to note about privatization is it doesn't change the overall rate of return in the economy. Or you can be taking that money from one bank account, right now it's invested in Google and GM, and you withdraw that money and put it into your private account that the government holds and invests for you, and it doesn't change the overall savings in the economy, which means it doesn't change the overall rate of return available in the economy. It might change who gets it a little bit, but there's no free lunch there from privatization at all. And it's completely hidden in the political debate. When we debated this in the second Bush term, no one really talked about the fact that there's no free lunch from privatization. You just change who's getting what. I think that's important to recognize. Another problem with privatization, of course, is transition. We didn't start off with a private system or funded system. That was the original intent of Social Security, but then we didn't do it. And so transitioning makes it very, very difficult. So given that there's really no change in the overall rates of return in the economy from having a funded or private system, and transition is very hard. I'm not sure that I would move there, or if I were going to move there, I'd move there very, very slowly. One last word about Medicare privatization. So this is the Ryan voucher program. And if you look at that program, some of the savings from that program are achieved because of the better incentive effects that people have in their own accounts. But almost all the savings in that program are achieved by simply capping the size of the vouchers to grow with GDP. Right? So when they do the estimates of the benefits of that program in terms of fiscal benefits, they're not seeing a lot from the incentive effects. It's mostly just because he's just capping payments.
If I might just say, I certainly favor this, and I just want to suggest that it emphasizes the importance of what these kind of pay-as-you-go programs, these government programs do to politics. That would do a very different thing to politics because people would feel a connection to their own accounts. It would make it, I think, somewhat harder for politicians. Of course, there are some who want to raise Social Security payments from the government and actually make this problem worse. So it would move things more from the arena of politics into a structure in which people would feel an accountability and a connection to their own money. And so I think that kind of cultural effect is as important as any economic one.
Thank you. Back microphone, please.
Thank you, Your Honor. John Mertens from Salt Lake City. My question concerns moral hazard. I believe there was a comment made that Social Security might be a way to mitigate moral hazard concerning savings in old age. And my question would be to the panel, would Social Security not be a way to exacerbate the moral hazard knowing that the government's going to provide for you?
Would Social Security make moral hazard worse? You have automatic savings, so you know you don't have to save because you know you've got money coming to you in Social Security. And Social Security also has labor effects, right? If you don't, it might reduce your work effort because you have this tax. If you don't connect that tax to future benefits, then you have a labor leisure distortion for Social Security as well. Yeah, that's going to be a cost of Social Security. It depends which way you think it's going to be worse. If you think that there's some reduction in savings because of Social Security, that's probably true, but then there'd be a huge benefit to people that might have, or a huge reduction in the number of people that would just be poor anyway, if you will, because of the lack of Social Security. So which way it cuts, I'm not sure, but I was going to say my intuition. I'm trying to think whether I know actually any studies that would tell us the actual answer rather than guessing, and I don't know which way it would go, or I don't know of any studies which way the net effects go.
One of the reasons that I favor the Social Security reform I described, which would eliminate, which would confine wage transfers to poverty elimination and doing it better than the current system does, is because I am actually fairly impressed with the evidence that very large Social Security wage transfer programs such as we have are depressing savings and are retarding family formation and in-family fertility. I think that those are pretty strong effects, and I think that if we think of Social Security as being a safety net for the elderly, but that a lot of our welfare when we are old is something that we think about when we are young in our individual lives, savings behavior, family formation behavior, I think that that's more socially satisfactory.
It's pretty hard to know, right, how much it reduces savings. You have no internal variation across the country, so how do you do a study that shows you that it actually reduces savings? I mean, I don't know.
Again, going
That's
to other nations, it appears that in certain European nations like Italy, where the transfers seem to be even greater to older people, that does have an effect on decreasing fertility. And you might think that actually harms older people in the long run, because one of the great comforts of old age is children and extended family. So I think if one really wants to think about the utility of Social Security, one might also want to think of its effects on the on things like fertility and other sources of comfort. Because I think it's a mistake to think that old age is only about material concerns, and in places like Europe, I do think it's had some effect on actually the ability to have extended families. So that was, of course, for much of human history, one of the reasons to have children.
Front microphone.
You haven't, Mary Ann Mealy from New Jersey. I'm interested in disability payments that come out of Social Security. I don't know anybody on Social Security disability who deserves to be on it. They're all frauds. And I also know that, for instance, a good friend of mine adopted his own granddaughter because his daughter is homeless, and he gets $1,200 a month tax-free from Social Security. So I'm interested in how much is fraud and how much are policy decisions, which, I mean, he's got more than enough money to raise his own granddaughter, but he takes that check every month. How much of that is impacting the Social Security payouts?
I can't give you an explicit answer, a numerical answer. I think that there are a lot of a disability program requires lots of judgments that are difficult to make, unlike knowing what your age is and how many years you worked and what your income was. So it's a very different kind of a program. I'm a newspaper reader, and there's a lot of plausible evidence of fraud in the program. And I think that is the case. It's also the case, as either Dave or John mentioned, that the Disability Trust Fund runs out the fourth quarter of next year. So this is the first time we are going to be facing the statutory policy of cutting benefits very significantly unless something is done. So this is going to be a big debate coming at us much sooner. If we followed the instincts that we followed in the last 30 or 40 years, we'd simply roll Social Security disability into retirement. But if you do that, you actually move the day of reckoning for Social Security retirement much, much further forward. So I think that's not going to work. So there's going to be a big debate, and the instances of fraud and abuse and some of these things that we've seen in Florida and West Virginia are going to be hotly debated.
One of the peculiarities of the disability insurance system under Social Security is that unlike many private workers' compensation programs and unlike the Veterans Disability Program, Social Security disability is yes, no. You are disabled or you are not. There's no concept of 10% disability, some other percentage disability. That's a possible source of change. Another thing one has to consider, I assume one of the reasons you're saying there is fraud is that the country as a whole has never been healthier, the average life expectation continues to go up, and the disability rolls are soaring. These two things can't be true at the same time. So some errors are obviously being made. One possibility is to change the program so that the total payout reflects the general health of the population. But whether that's politically feasible, I leave to others.
Yeah, so the number of people on DI has gone up dramatically over the last 4 or 5 years since the recession. And also, if you look at the number of people applying for DI, or when they apply, when their unemployment benefits expire, you see the spike in applications. But that doesn't mean they're not disabled, right? Because it might be that they don't have to apply for DI while they have unemployment benefits, and they have to once those benefits expire. So you only can look at that data and know that there's fraud in the system. Again, the large increase in DI payments since the Great Recession, again, doesn't necessarily tell you that there's fraud in the system. It might be that people were able to make do with part-time work and so forth when those jobs are available, even though they are sort of disabled, but can't when those jobs are no longer available. So I don't know if we know how much fraud there is in the system. There must be studies that have done comprehensive audits of groups of people to see. I don't know what those studies say.
Are you impressed by the general trend that Judge Easterbrook mentioned?
Well, the one fact he didn't mention, which is work is now less physical than it used to be. So the trend should be even stronger.
Yes, it should be.
Than what Judge Easterbrook said.
Back microphone.
Yes. Alden Abbott, McLean, Virginia. Would the panelists comment on possible elimination of a federal income tax and move to a consumption tax and its effects on intergenerational equity?
This is Professor Weisbach's.
Oh, well, it would depend on how we did it. So there's essentially two extreme ways to do it. One is cold turkey and one is full transition. Cold turkey is tomorrow we put in a VAT or some other consumption tax system. And what that does is you've got all this money in your savings account. Suppose you had some money in your savings account. And when you withdraw that, it's already paid taxes, but when you draw it to buy bubble gum, all of a sudden you pay the tax again. So this is kind of double tax on existing savings if you go cold turkey. The alternative is full transition. So you take all that money that's already saved and you say that doesn't have to pay consumption tax again. And the intergenerational effects are basically entirely dependent on what choice you make or how you dial that choice in or out. They can be very, very large on the existing generation, or they can be zero on the existing generation. That's a political choice that we would have to make if we shifted to a consumption tax.
Thank you. Front microphone.
Ilya Soman, George Mason University. All three of you have proposed pretty substantial reforms to the existing system, but as John at least briefly pointed out, it would have to go through some sort of political process to implement those reforms, and as he also noted, most of the public doesn't even realize anything like the magnitude of this problem. They think Social Security is a fraction of the percentage of federal budget that it actually is. I think maybe if we cut foreign aid, our fiscal problems would be solved. So how could we achieve these sorts of reforms given real-world political constraints, including ignorance, but perhaps also other ones as well?
I'll say I'm a tenured professor. I don't know politics.
Well,
I'm a judge. I can't even listen to the answers.
we are all academics on this panel, and I think that academics are much better at describing. It's just in the nature of the thing. It requires political leadership, and that sounds sort of vapid, but that is what it comes down to. We've actually seen some progress that we have an incoming chairman of the Ways and Means Committee who has had a series of proposals for Social Security and Medicare reform that would have been inconceivable a couple of years ago. Is some sign of progress. I believe that my own view is that we will get pretty close to crisis before the political system is galvanized. I don't think it's a partisan issue. I think the Democrats are much more affiliated and committed to continuing the current programs without reform. But the essential dynamics are, I think, the one that I described, that the population is used to getting much more benefits than taxes, and they like it this way, and it's not going to be easy. So I believe that we'll get pretty close to my scenario 3, unfortunately. But
If you're the next president, whoever he or she may be, if you look back at what happened to Bush, W. Bush, and Obama, both of them either proposed or actually enacted changes to entitlement programs and got drawn and quartered. Right, and so the question is whether you want to be the next president that's drawn and quartered.
I can't be president, but...
Yeah.
The only thing I would say is I think it is probable that the Social Security crisis, I don't think can be as easily solved just within itself. In other words, I think, just as I've tried to suggest, that bringing in entitlements has helped create a transfer state, which creates a fiscal war of all against all. I think there'll need to be, to really solve this, some other reforms about government, more generally shrinking government and more generally creating greater constraints on government transfers, because otherwise I think it's going to be very hard to persuade people to say, well, you should give up your Social Security, because otherwise they'll think this money's just going even beyond. They don't think it's that much of the budget. They'll think, well, this money's going to be used somewhere else. So I think we actually have to broaden how we think about the Social Security and other old age entitlement crisis. I think it's just part of a more crisis of the general crisis of the modern welfare state, and where people would like to live off other people, and expanding, therefore, the scope of politics. So I'm, in some sense, more pessimistic, I think, than the other people on the panel about changing these old age entitlements incrementally without a more general restructuring of our understandings of the obligation of the person to the state.
Back microphone.
Brian Bishop from the Stephen Hopkins Center for Civil Rights in Rhode Island. And my libertarian side embraces, in an abstract way, the ideas for privatization and the incentives that potentially arise in effectively having a closer connection with one's own money and savings. But if we conceive of Social Security as kind of institutionalizing intergenerational transfer, which we recognize as an important familial institution prior to that, aren't the privatization schemes, finally completely break? My Burkean side says to me, if there was a value to intergenerational transfer, or there was something from that society got from that or saw in it, don't the privatization schemes completely eliminate that connection?
Yeah, they might, right? So the Social Security system that I was imagining in my simple two-period generations was one where you had a connection to your previous generation, and that was a social compact. And if you didn't have that, then you don't have that kind of social compact. It still exists within the family, and people transfer to their parents and to their kids. But the idea that you can have some sort of agreement where we all provide for the previous generation, I think makes sense to me.
Thank you. One final question from the front microphone, and we will keep this on time.
Yes, sir. James Brislin, Enfield, Connecticut. My question is a follow-up on Social Security disability. There was talk of the issue of some fraud, and I've seen both fraud and I've seen, construction and manual labor type workers who get SSD because they really can't work anymore. One of the features of SSD is that you get this declaration that you're permanently and totally disabled, and then that's it. You receive SSD forever. Should there be intermediate or periodic medical examinations by doctors employed by Social Security to determine whether or not somebody still qualifies as permanently and totally disabled, particularly given on the improved notion of health and the fact that, somebody could have particular health conditions that go into remission, or there's not an issue subsequent.
Sounds good to me.
Yeah, sounds like a good idea.
We do need to recognize that this has been done before. It was actually done during the Reagan administration, and people were taken off the rolls. There was an enormous political outpouring of unhappiness about that. Courts started enjoining those decisions. The basis of those injunctions continues to escape me. So one, there's a large political dimension here, and no president since has attempted it. The head of the Social Security Administration has seen the consequences. What the politics of that would be at a time when the amount of money for disability payments is about to be exhausted, it's very difficult to say, and I'm not the right one to say it.
I mean, it just strikes me that this is an excellent example of the problem of politics, right? The costs of adding one disability person to the roll are diffused, or just a few cents on everyone. So why would you think that government would be very good at keeping people off the disability rolls if it's a government program, or actually enforcing that? I think there are structures that are deep in the nature of democratic politics that make that difficult. Because if someone, and of course if you do ramp up the the scrutiny, some poor person will be unfairly denied things, and this will be a political, become a political issue in the way that these costs, although they're very significant since they're diffused and largely invisible, really will not be captured. And that goes, to my mind, the real problem with much of the structure of these old age programs. They increase the scope of politics and therefore make it much less likely we're going to make sensible decisions about disability as opposed to when charity was a more private enterprise.
For disability programs, there are huge incentive problems on the administrative side. The decisions on many of these are made by administrative law judges. They are paid on salary. They are not compensated for whether they decide these cases accurately. And if they decide to grant disability benefits, they don't have to write very much. If they decide to deny the application for disability benefits, they have to write a really long opinion, and then a U.S. Court of Appeals may tell them it wasn't long enough, please try again. There should be no surprise what administrative law judges do when faced with those incentives. And one wonders whether those are the correct incentives, but I think that's beyond the scope, and we are beyond our time. I want you to thank the presenters today. But before we go, just a reminder that lunch is now available. There are some breakout sessions where lunch is being served in the room. For those of you who don't want to go to those, go up to the second floor and you can have a lunch without the need to listen to any speakers. But why anybody would want to come here and not listen to speakers is beyond me. So, thank you very much.